In 2010, Pew released a survey showing that atheists tended to know significantly more about the Bible than those who profess it to be the Word of God. And as unsurprising as these results were to we non-believers, many atheists still arm themselves for debates with Christians by studying up on theology and Scripture. But today's Christian, especially today's American Christian, increasingly grounds their arguments not in theology, but in history, or some illusionary variant thereof. And that means that atheists need to turn increasingly to history to refute them. Well, thanks to my guest today, that just got a lot easier. Andrew Seidel is a constitutional attorney with the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the author of the upcoming book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Andrew, welcome to The Scathing Atheist.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
I got to say, usually when I have a lawyer on named Andrew, it's not you.
Is it that Torres guy?
Yeah, I feel like I'm committing androltery or something.
That's one of the commandments, man. You got to be careful.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Our nation was founded on these things, after all. Okay, so speaking of that, every good book needs a good villain. So let's start with the villain here, just so that we're all working from the same definition. What is Christian nationalism?
Christian nationalism is the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation or founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and that it needs to go back to that foundation right now. It is now a wildly popular view. It used to be sort of this kind of impotent sideshow that really only the extreme fringes of more conservative politics adopted, but now it is in the mainstream. And it is actually the reason that Donald Trump is president.
Yeah, in your book, you present some damn convincing statistics that is the primary factor, really.
I mean, and this is not my research. This is Andrew Whitehead out of Clemson has done some brilliant work on this. And he actually examined the data from the 2016 election. And the biggest predictor of whether or not somebody was going to be a Trump voter was not their political party, which is kind of amazing. It was not their socioeconomic status, despite all the stories that tell us otherwise. It wasn't even whether or not they were a Christian. It wasn't their religion. It was whether or not they were a Christian nationalist. That was the number one factor that made somebody a Trump voter. So we don't just see Christian nationalism as this weird sideshow anymore. It is the reason Donald Trump is president. He rode this wave of Christian nationalism into the highest office in the land.
Yeah, it was pretty obvious that was his goal as soon as he picked Mike Pence as his VP there.
And they've been remarkably good at employing the rhetoric. I mean, Trump is, I think he's an atrocious public speaker, but a lot of Christian nationalism is focused on these myths and really the underlying emotion of what it means to be an American. And Trump is very good and has become even better since he's entered office at playing those Christian nationalist heartstrings. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit alarming to see, in my opinion.
Yeah, this from a Presbyterian that had to ask another Presbyterian whether that was a kind of Christian. Okay, so now we know that, you and I know anyway, that America was not founded as a Christian nation. So why does it matter to them so much to build this mythical history?
It's incredibly important because a lot of their political power is tied up in it. So the lies surrounding whether or not America was founded as a Christian nation, all these myths that they have about the American founding and prayer at the Constitutional Convention and phrases like "In God We Trust," "One Nation Under God," "God Bless America," all of that, those lies make up the Christian nationalist identity, and that is where they get their political power. These lies are driving public policy. We see it in education policy, immigration policy, civil rights, women's rights, minority rights, LGBTQ rights, even our foreign policy when they moved the embassy to Israel. And prominently these days in the redefinition of religious freedom as basically a codification of discrimination. I mean, judges now are deciding cases based on these lies and myths. So it's not just in the culture war issues, but in many areas beyond that. And I mean, if you had to put it simply, it would be that these lies are destroying our country, really. They're gnawing away at our liberty. And I think that we, the people, have a duty to stand up to the lies and to the bullies pushing them.
Yeah, I mean, the Constitution doesn't invoke God, but it sure invokes us. Yeah.
It absolutely does, right there in the first three words.
All right. So the whole argument is that like it says that the government, the legal system, et cetera, are grounded in Judeo-Christian principles. Now, this is a question that people don't ask enough, but you address really well in your book. What are Judeo-Christian principles?
And that question was actually one of the things that kind of led me to write this book. Because if you've ever had a debate about whether or not we're a Christian nation, and you know, even the most basic facts about American history, and if you're an atheist, you tend to go straight to the Treaty of Tripoli when somebody claims that we're a Christian nation. But the fallback position is always, well, I actually didn't mean that we're a Christian nation. I meant that we're founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Mm-hmm. And I have this argument for a living. I mean, this is a big part of what I do at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, is try to get government officials to stop using their public office to promote their personal religion. And I'll write them a letter and explain, hey, you can't tell kindergartners and first graders to pray before they go down to lunch. That's illegal. And one of the things that we'll always get back is, well, actually, we were founded as a Christian nation, so that's okay. So I've been having this argument for a living, and the argument that I kept hearing in return was, after it was debunked, well, we're founded on Judeo-Christian principles. And whenever you follow up on that, well, name one. What is a Judeo-Christian principle? People did not have a good answer for that. The Christian nationalists did not have a good answer for that. And so I set about to figure out, exactly what is a Judeo-Christian principle and how could it possibly have influenced the founding of our nation. And it turns out that if you look at those Judeo-Christian principles, especially the ones that are central to the Christian nationalist identity, they are so thoroughly opposed to the principles on which the United States was built. I mean, they differ and they conflict to such a degree that, to put it bluntly, as I do in the book, Christianity is un-American.
You make a very powerful argument for that throughout. So, okay, let's compare then. What would a nation that was actually built on Judeo-Christian values look like?
It would look a lot like the early settlements in Massachusetts that the Pilgrims and the Puritans created, I think. Those were these sort of monochromatic theocracies that really worked to enforce religious conformity and uniformity using the government. And if you saw a government founded on Judeo-Christian principles today, I think it would look a lot like that. I mean, it might look a lot like what we would see in the Middle East now, just with a different religion as the motivating factor. I mean, and to tie into your previous question a little bit, so those Judeo-Christian principles, if you listen to the believers, it's the main principles in the Bible. It's the principles in the Ten Commandments. And generally, if you talk to any person, any American out on the street, they tend to think of those as positive, good principles. But once you dig in, you find out that they're really not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you touched on this already a little bit, but most of the time when atheists are called upon to refute Christian nationalism, they go straight to the Treaty of Tripoli, right? And that's good, right? The United States is in no way a Christian nation is a pretty good quote to have in your back pocket, but the Christian nationalists also have quotes in their back pocket, and they can present those and make it seem like the founding fathers are also saying the opposite. Your book does a lot more than that. So if you don't mind, can you expound a little bit on what your plan of attack was when you set out to refute their narrative?
Yes. There are a lot of even good Christian nation, quote unquote, books out there that do a pretty good job of refuting the myth. But I wanted to take a different tact. And so there are kind of two main differences, I think, between my book and some of the other books that are out there. The first is, again, that as soon as we debunk that Christian nation myth, they always fall back on, I meant founded on Judeo-Christian principles. So I actually focus on that second myth. Because if it pervades all the other Christian nationalist arguments out there. If America was not founded on Judeo-Christian principles, it is not a Christian nation. All of their other arguments failed. And while many authors have refuted that first fiction, the Christian nation, nobody's ever touched that second myth. So I went and I compared Judeo-Christian principles to our founding principles. I compared the Bible to the Constitution. I compared the Ten Commandments to the 10 Amendments. And I really walk the reader through and argue not only that we were not founded on Judeo-Christian principles, but again, that those principles are opposed to the values that founded America. That's kind of the first big difference. And the second big difference was my approach. Previous books have offered they've offered gentle corrections to the Christian nationalists. Actually, guys, here's what history tells us. Here's what the founders actually meant. Here's what the founders actually said. And they kind of leave it at that. But correction is not enough. Otherwise, President Trump would not be President Trump. Then I also go on the offensive. This book is an assault on the Christian nationalist identity. Not only are Christian nationalists wrong, their beliefs and identity run counter to the ideals on which this nation was founded. They are un-American. And I think that's really kind of critical because we are in a fight for what it means to be an American. Their goal at its most basic level is to redefine what it means to be an American. They want to say that to be an American is to be a Christian, but patriotism has no religion. And honestly, this is not a fight that we can afford to lose.
Well said. Well said. Well, I'll tell you what, you are absolutely speaking our audience's language when you talk about going on the offensive. But I want to give you a chance to respond to a potential criticism that I think you'll probably run into. In the book, you say things like, Christian principles are un-American. You compare God to a gorilla in a threat display. Are you worried that you're turning away potentially sympathetic Christian readers when you say stuff like that?
Not particularly. I mean, calling out Christian nationalism as un-American, I can understand maybe why that might be distasteful to some people. The word un-American might make some people squeamish because there's this inherent value judgment in it. But the point I'm trying to make is we are in a fight for our values. America is in a fight for its values, and Christian nationalism is warping and torching those values. It's dragging our country down this dark hole. So to hesitate to describe that identity with apt phrases because they might be unpleasant is to see the American identity to an imposter. To refuse to label that which is antithetical to America is to watch Christian nationalists hijack our nation.
Yeah, the thing is that they certainly aren't avoiding that, right? Like, so it would be a unilateral disarmament if we did.
That's a great way to put it. I think that makes perfect sense. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's also kind of the principle that this show was founded on as well. All right, so now the book is broken down into 4 sections. The first section kind of deals with the quotes, and then you go into more of the stuff that you were just discussing. And then the book sort of closes off with a lot of discussion about the Christian phrases that have sort of crept into our government language. God bless America, one nation under God, et cetera. These are, we cover a lot of this stuff on the show, and invariably I get atheists that'll comment on it, that'll write in and say, hey, man, these fights don't matter, right? Like the fights that matter are the fights for gay rights and the fights for this, that, the other, whatever their XYZ issues are as the most important ones. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Why do fights like this matter so much?
That's an excellent question. And it's something that, especially working at FFRF, that we get in our work all the time. And I've given a talk repeatedly on this. I'm sure there's a version up on YouTube somewhere called something usually titled like Sweat the Small Stuff, why it's important to challenge these small violations. And especially when you're talking about these phrases like in God we trust or one nation under God, they are symbols. And we disregard the power of symbols at our own peril. Greta Christina wrote a great piece on this once, and she pointed out that, segregated drinking fountains weren't really the biggest problem facing the civil rights movement. Segregated lunch counters weren't really that big a deal, but they were symbolic of the larger fight and important to tear down those symbols for that reason. So I think that's something that everybody needs to keep in mind. They can certainly go check out the talk that I gave. I think I gave it at one of the FFRF conventions. And as I'm answering that, I'm thinking about another point to your previous question about turning certain members of my audience off with some maybe stronger language. And I should say too, I don't think I'm going to convince Christian nationalists with this book to change their minds. I'm aiming at secular Americans and the middle section of the country, trying to wake them up and arm them for this argument. so that they can turn around and when they hear a Christian nationalist spout this nonsense, correct that error, shout that argument down, defeat them so that it doesn't get repeated and end up in our legislation or in a court case, a judge citing it in a court case to decide the law erroneously.
Yeah, which is a real thing, by the way, that Andrew points out in his book, that that's not a hypothetical there.
No, it is absolutely not a hypothetical. I have seen that happen.
And I can say, as a person who just read the book, you do a great job of exactly that. Because the arguments are worse than you think. If you just have like a sort of a cursory understanding of American history, as I do, and you have a cursory understanding of the law, you can refute these arguments pretty convincingly, but they're actually way worse than you think. And this book does a great job, I think, of arming you with, not just the baseline refutation, but like you said, the offensive bit that goes after that, right?
Absolutely. And that is the primary goal of it. So if you take things like In God We Trust or One Nation Under God, since we were just talking about those, most of your listeners probably know that those are not from the founding era. In God We Trust was first added to the coins in 1863, 64. And then the 1950s, we saw this huge wave. And they'll leave it at that. But that actually tells us, and if you look at the history, it tells us even more, that Christian nationalists used deliberately, they took advantage of times of strife and division in this country to impose their religion on everybody else. I mean, it was deliberately done. One of the Christian nationalists who's responsible for getting In God We Trust on our money specifically said that during the Civil War, when our country is tearing itself apart, brothers are killing brothers, that was a, quote, propitious time. It was lucky that was going on because they could get the money or their God on our money.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Well, luckily, we're not in a divisive time where the country is rent apart now, where they could really get their foot in the door. All right. So I've got a one last question for you that I didn't warn you about this one, so I apologize if I'm putting you on the spot here. But was there ever a point as you were writing this book that you thought to yourself, damn it, I'm a real life lawyer. I cannot believe I have to refute an argument this fucking stupid?
There were a few times where it did get a little frustrating, but it's odd because the other side's argument, the Christian nationalist argument, is so predictable. It follows this very specific pattern, and I've not seen, in the 10 years that it's taken me to write this book, basically, I have not seen anything new from the other side. They have no original arguments. They have no original scholarship. They have no real history backing up their claims. And it makes it easier for our side to shred it if we understand the arguments to do so. So it was still fun to write. And there is something to be said for dunking on a Christian nationalist anyway.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I got to say, one of my greatest pleasures in life is reading books by smart guys tearing down arguments from dumb guys, especially when those arguments are, a clear and present danger. So, thanks for the book. Thanks for the information. Thanks for the great read.
That was my pleasure. And thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. And if you're as excited about the book as I was before I read it, the book is available for pre-order now. It's releasing on May 14th. It's densely packed with information, but still manages to be a really fun, easy read. So if you want to learn once more that the Christian arguments are even worse than you thought, check the show notes for a link to pre-order your copy. Once again, the name of the book is The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American by Andrew L. Seidel. You got to have an initial if you want to be a great author, after all. Andrew, thanks again for hanging out, man.
It is absolutely my pleasure.